We called him Daddy Pete. We weren't sure why we called him that. I mean, he wasn't our daddy. His name wasn't even Pete. His name was Earl Edgar Ward, and he was my mother's father. Now, y'all travel a lot now in these days, but back in the 50s and early 60s, folks didn't go on long vacations, and Daddy Pete lived in Oklahoma, where my parents had met during the war, and we lived in Illinois, where they'd moved after my sister was born. I don't recall Daddy Pete ever coming to Illinois, and I know we only went out there a few times. Well, as happens with families that are separated by years and distance, after Mother died and Daddy Pete died, we lost track of that whole part of the family. And then one day the email came. It said, "Hi, I think we're related. My half-sister was Betty Ward. I think she was your mother. My father was Pete Ward. I think you knew him by Daddy Pete." I'd found my Aunt Pam, or more like my Aunt Pam had found me. She was one of the children from Daddy Pete's second marriage. See, my grandparents had divorced when my mother was very young, and they had separate families after that. So I wrote back and said, "I remember you at a family event, and I talked a bit about things that I knew, and I said, but I don't know anything about your dad. I remembered he always wore a cowboy hat, and my sister and I thought that was because he lived in Oklahoma, and it was the law. You had to wear a cowboy hat. But then as my brothers got older and kind of grew up through their hair, we thought, well, maybe that's why Daddy Pete wore that cowboy hat, to keep his head covered." And she wrote back and thanked me for a picture I'd sent, and she said, "Yes, I do recognize Daddy's hairline in your picture in your brother's heads, but he wore that cowboy hat because he was a cowboy. He worked cattle on ranches and roped calves in the rodeo till he was near 58 years old." She could remember lots of fun times when they'd be out running around the yard and Daddy Pete would be out there with his lasso, and they knew one of them was going to get caught. And I wrote back and said, "Those are really interesting stories, but do you have a picture? Because I have no pictures of my grandfather." And I didn't really feel a connection. And then the email came with the picture. And it was too big. Those of you who have computers, when sometimes a picture is too big for your screen and you have to scroll down to see just a piece of it at a time. And I saw the top of a cowboy hat, the ears of a horse, the brim of the hat, the eyes of the horse and the forelock, the face of the horse, the eyes and nose of the man, and my mother's mouth. I hadn't seen my mother's face in 30 years at that point. I didn't even realize I remembered what her mouth looked like, but there it was. And I messed with the picture until I got it all on one screen. And there it was. A cowboy in muddy chaps and a sweat-stained work coat, and a cowboy hat on, holding on to his horse, and smiling back at me with my mother's mouth. And I had my connection. That was my Daddy Pete. He was a cowboy, and I am his granddaughter. Now, I found out in learning more about my family that the reason Grandma and Daddy Pete broke up was